CRT in schools. What is it? What's going on? What have you heard about in the news? This is a controversy a little over a year in the making. It is not really new in the long scheme of American history, but it is certainly a new front in the culture wars over what is being taught in schools. So we'll take a look at where this controversy comes from, what's really going on behind it, and what does it mean for education. So what exactly is the problem and where did it begin? Many of the CRT ban debates began to appear early in 2020. This was a response to Black Lives Matter protests, diversity training, all kinds of diversity groups existing in schools like LGBTQ+ clubs, ethnic studies curriculums, diversity reviews of what's stocked in school libraries. And President Trump took a lot of the energy surrounding these debates and made an executive order in September 2020 banning diversity training in federally funded programs, specifically citing CRT as a threat to the idea of what America stands for. The difficulty is CRT isn't actually what's being banned. So the CRT bans themselves cover things that are not actually part of CRT. CRT was a framework for thinking about racism in laws and institutions beginning in the 60s and 70s, and the scholars who write about it mostly share and showcase their work in the realm of law and public policy, so you'd be more likely to hear about it in law school. Most of the bans are actually going after ideas that aren't even in CRT. So where is this happening? Right now, CRT or similar divisive concept bans have been introduced in a number of states listed here. These span the nation. Many of them you can see are southern, a few in the Tornado Alley corridor, a few western ones as well. Most of the bans have central claims such as, if you focus on race, that is racist. Divisive concepts teach children to hate themselves. They have negative feelings about themselves, or they hate their country. The educational system should be patriotic in nature. Many of the bans believe that teachers and professors indoctrinate their students, so a captive audience of students is being brainwashed, and that CRT itself originates in Marxist thought. So people are being encouraged to see CRT as this horrific threat to education. And when you take a look at the bans, the reason why these central claims push the idea this threat needs to be contained is that there's a coordinated effort to pass similar laws through political action communities. For example, the Heritage Foundation created a private briefing for lawmakers in May 2020 to discuss model legislation. And there have been other conservative think tanks that have also suggested model legislation. So when you look at it, almost all of the laws sound exactly the same. So what's being banned? What exactly is being banned if it's not CRT? So this is the Oklahoma ban. It's one of the earliest to pass. This passed May the 4th, 2021. And you'll see laws similar to this being debated in the legislatures across the United States mentioned on the previous slide. So don't be surprised if the language is very similar. No student can be forced to take diversity training. No staff member can be forced to take diversity training is an addition in some of the laws. And then here's a list of things that you'll typically find in the bans. By the way, none of this is in the CRT framework. No school can teach that one race or sex is inherently superior, or that individuals are inherently racist or sexist. Anyone should be discriminated against on the basis of race or sex cannot be taught in the school. A person's moral character is determined by their race or sex, and that their individual personhood bears responsibility for actions committed by those of their race or sex in the past. That also can't be taught in schools. And D, any individual should experience discomfort or guilt on the basis of race or sex. That cannot be done in schools. And schools may not teach that meritocracies, like the United States, are inherently racist or sexist. The language will vary from law to law, slightly depending on who wrote it, but essentially they're all the same, and this is the kind of wording you'll see in most of them. So what's going on? If these bans aren't actually about CRT, and this is a coordinated effort by conservatives, what's underlying this? When you get right down to it, all of the bills have similar languages that originate in fear. And the fear is, one, if schools, if Americans in general address diversity and inequality, then it will burden white students. It will make those students feel guilt or negative emotions or anxiety over the past, and therefore we don't want to burden these students or make them feel bad about their history. So that's one of the fears underlying these bans. Another fear underlying the bans is that if you got students to actively think about inequality and the history of the United States, these concepts would make those students vote differently in the future. Educated voters would demand structural changes to address racism. They would see racism for what it is, and then they would vote people out, and those people are afraid that they'll be voted out if kids are educated. So those are two real fears underlying what's really going on here. A sense that the past needs to be protected to protect white students in the future, and that if people are educated, they will vote differently, and that will throw some people out of power. All of the laws being proposed as CRT bans, they are all being sponsored by Republicans. So we might ask ourselves, what do they envision instead? If CRT is a threat, if it's indoctrination, if it's dangerous, what's their alternative proposal? One place to find what is proposed instead is the 1776 pledge, which many conservative politicians are being encouraged to sign. For example, the governor of South Dakota has signed this pledge. And when you go and look at the 1776 pledge website, this is what it will say should be taught in schools. The U.S. is an exceptional nation striving for a more perfect union. Exceptional means that the U.S. is better and much more advanced and beyond any of the other nations of the world in its political system, that it has a history that sets it apart from other nations. The founders, all men, are heroes, and sometimes you'll see they'll add to this list of heroes people like Martin Luther King Jr., sometimes Frederick Douglass is added as well, but generally it's just a list of 5 or 6 men, and these are the only heroes that we should worship. Children should take pride in American history and praise America's story of liberty and equality. So teaching about the past should be an issue of pride. We should essentially indoctrinate students to love their country. Civics should only focus on founding documents. So students should learn about the Constitution, they should learn about the Declaration of Independence, but they should not engage in actual political advocacy or action. So civics should only be about reading, not action itself. Teaching children to hate their country is immoral. So children should grow up loving the United States patriotically. And students should not be taught to divide against each other on the basis of race or sex. So they shouldn't see people's differences at all. They should see themselves as just the same and part of the same identity. So what actually is CRT if it's none of these things that are being banned? CRT itself argues that laws, rules, institutions, justice systems, educational systems, every system that's bigger than a person, an individual person, embeds racism within the system. Not always consciously, but very often consciously. And the reason these systems have racism embedded in them is because historically there have been a lot of racist policies in the United States that benefit some people over other people. And so institutions outlast the life of a human. They perpetuate and carry these policies from generation to generation. Now, the CRT folks would point to the fact that these systems have different outcomes for different people. So someone who enters the educational system may end up in a different place than someone else. And we can see that statistically when we analyze large groups of people over time to see how some laws benefit certain groups more than they benefit others, or how some institutions, like financial institutions or stock market, for example, might benefit certain people over other people. One of the core ideas in CRT is that racism really isn't an individual action. Psychologists would point to the fact that individuals can show prejudice, individuals can discriminate against other people, so you can have racist actions from individuals. But more than that, racism is a set of policies and laws and actions that utilize prejudice for a certain group to retain power. And that power lasts over generations. It's not the story of one individual enacting something that's racist. That's very difficult sometimes for people to grasp, the idea that racism can outlive us. That, you know, one of your ancestors, for example, could decide to do something, create a rule, a law, and the effects could continue into the present. So it makes the problem of racism bigger than just an individual trying to be nice. So if the bans aren't actually about CRT, what is really going on here? What's at the root of all of the divisiveness, the hatred, the vitriol being spewed by opponents of CRT? For one thing, CRT is a convenient catch-all. It's a code that can be used to label all kinds of anti-racist policies. And it sounds scary because people don't know what it is. In fact, opponents have called it monstrous, they've called it an evil. They've used words that evoke emotional responses of fear. This purposeful branding that conservatives have in fact admitted to that they branded it this way is a better sell than just opposing anti-racist policies. So if a school adopts anti-racism as its policy, well, you don't want to say, I oppose anti-racism, because then logically that means you're racist. So CRT is a better sell in terms of saying what you oppose. This is a form of what political scientists have called dog whistle politics. Dog whistles are terms that are codes for what the speaker really means. And they're powerfully evocative emotionally by tapping into deep emotional fears without needing to explain yourself. You can simply just say, I oppose CRT, and everybody in the room who's with you knows what you're saying. They know what you're standing for. Logically, though, this makes CRT bans a straw man. So that's a logical fallacy in which you're attacking a problem that actually isn't a problem. In fact, conservatives have made up this problem. They have made up this boogeyman. And the reason for making up this boogeyman is that it can be used to generate support for your cause. All you have to do is convince people that there's a great evil to be destroyed, get people motivated to destroy that evil, whether that evil actually exists or not. The irony is, CRT isn't actually even taught in K-12 settings. Most public school teachers, even at the high school level, don't actually know anything about CRT because it's typically encountered in law school. So who's doing this? Who's behind it? Is this new? Not really. This is a long-running debate in the United States that even can kind of be seen back in the Cold War. Many folks might remember in the 1990s the debate over multiculturalism and the publication of a book about the disuniting of America in the 1990s, that focusing on people's differences actually was bad for the United States, when those folks were saying, well, you just never focused on my difference before, and now I'm asking to be included. What's being challenged here is a sort of Cold War consensus history of the United States that emerged during the late 40s and early 50s, where the U.S. is a good nation. The U.S. is always good. Even when it's faltered, it was doing things for the right reasons. That consensus history got challenged in the 60s by scholars of race and sex in America to say, not so sure the United States has always been good, because sometimes the U.S. has done things that have not been good for other people. And this challenging of the dominant narrative has unsettled many of the conservatives. As advances in minority rights and demands for equality and equity across the United States accelerate, conservatives push back. So they're able to use the controversy to stir up their political base through organized political action committees and even groups like No Left Turn, which tries to organize kind of an appearance of a grassroots movement to get rid of leftist indoctrination in schools. The irony is, of course, they want to impose their own indoctrination. So this is an interesting bit of hypocrisy when you get right down to what's actually going on. So what does this mean? Well, there are 165 advocacy groups protesting CRT currently. They are inundating school boards, conducting recall campaigns. They're doing public records requests. For example, one parent requested every bit of curriculum, every book on gender in the libraries for middle and high school curricula. And the school district estimated it would take 300 hours to compile the information. The kicker, the parent only had a kindergartner. So what's happening is that these sort of appearance of grassroots movements are trying to overwhelm school systems. And that is working because of the historical nature of school boards controlling education locally. That is the context for teaching and learning in the United States. There is no national curriculum. There are no sort of top-down directives except at the state level. And then still in many cases, it's local control. So school boards have been the vehicle through which many conservatives are pushing these bans for CRT, not just at state legislature levels. And one conservative has actually been quoted as saying, the road to the conservative takeover will be through the school boards. So what this is doing is putting a lot of pressure on educators. What can I teach? What I can't teach? If I say something, am I going to be continually harassed? If I stand up for my students of color, my students who are LGBTQIA+, will I get called to task for that? Will I be potentially disciplined or fired? And this is creating a climate of fear that is pretty similar to the McCarthyist tactics of the 1950s, of creating enough anxiety that people will self-censor and silence so that they don't get in trouble. The idea is, am I going to be called to task for what I actually said or for what somebody thinks I said? What gets reported? Are children going to be sent to record my lessons, to spy on me in the classroom so mom can conduct a campaign against me? What this also implies is a chilling effect on classroom discussion. So not just the kids of color or diverse backgrounds, but all kids in the room might feel the fear, the climate of being able to say what they actually think, because the teacher will be inhibited in leading discussion. And so certain discussions, if they head in certain directions, might get shut down. And the message sent around the room is, we can't talk about this. So for students from diverse backgrounds, this has to feel especially threatening to say that now my identity, who I am as a human being, my history as part of the United States is so controversial that it can't be taught. For fear that some white child might feel anxiety or guilt, and that child's mother might go on the rampage. How far this will go is hard to say. So the state legislatures will try these bans, but we haven't seen whether or not many of them will be challenged in court yet, because some of them do contain language that in fact is problematic in legal terms, in terms of First Amendment rights. Even though school boards have generally a large amount of control over what is being taught in the classroom, they do not have the power to censor the First Amendment rights of educators when it pertains to an item of public issue. And there's quite a bit of case law on this. But that won't stop the anxiety or the fear of where this might go in this new culture war. So this is something to pay attention to as we move forward in the future and ask ourselves, what does it mean to be well-rounded as a student, to encounter different ideas, to not fall into the vulgar error of thinking I am persecuted when I am contradicted, so that I can learn more about the United States, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of the things that make up the story of America, and not just the vision that many of these conservatives have actually demanded that students be indoctrinated in.